quite a while. In fact, I began my work in trade during the National.
Wieder ins Mikro.
Is that better?
Das Mikro einschalten.
Maybe not. Is it better now?
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. Great. So I've been working on trade agreements since the beginning of the NAFTA debate, often in coalition, and most often focusing on what the impacts of these trade agreements would be on our partners in developing countries, what it would mean for their efforts to reshape their food systems. This agreement's a little bit different, but I think it's kind of exciting in getting at these issues in a somewhat different way. There's a different set of issues involved and some different actors. In the United States, I'm finding that we have the chance to engage the local foods movements. People are really trying to reshape our food systems as political actors in the trade debate, something they really haven't been involved in up to now. So if we know who we want to have involved, we also need to think about who's on the other side, which in this case is Big Ag. Big Ag, for the most part, has been shaping decisions about the kind of food we eat, how much we pay for food, how much farmers are paid. For a long time, and really many decisions on our food systems. What we have now is a situation where in many communities across the United States, in Europe and elsewhere, people are taking back some of that control, and we need to figure out how this trade agreement would affect that kind of decision making. So to get at it, I'd like to focus on three issues: transparency, investment, and progress at the local level that we're trying to defend. Now, we've heard several speakers complain about the lack of transparency in negotiations. That is a real problem, and it is absolutely a political choice. In other trade negotiations, full texts have been published online. I was involved in work on the Free Trade Area of the Americas. Full text was published online, along with brackets indicating points of disagreement, so civil society and all actors could look and see precisely what was being negotiated. It's similar with the WTO now, where negotiating proposals are also posted online. The fact governments tell us they can't do this, that it's not done. In fact, it has been done, and it's a choice now if they'd like to do that or not, or if we continue to have to be detectives, sorting out what bits and pieces of information we can find and deducing from that really what might be at stake. So we're in that stage of being detectives. So one place we've been looking are corporate submissions to USTR on the trade agreements. I don't know how it works in Europe, but in the US, USTR requested comments on the TTIP, and about 350 organizations, including my own, made submissions. So we can look at what the corporations say they want out of this agreement. And on food, there are some pretty consistent comments. Groups like the American Chemistry Council, the Transatlantic Business Council, the National Chicken Council, all speak out pretty strongly against the use of the precautionary principle, which they attack as unscientific and unfairly restricting their exports. I was at a stakeholder event in Washington during the last round of negotiations, and a representative from CropLife America cited new right-to-know laws in Europe, which he thought were entirely unfair because it meant that more information was being published about chemicals they use, like glyphosate, which they said was a trade secret and should be off the table. One fairly consistent set of comments I heard at the stakeholder event were different big ag companies saying this absolutely has to be what they call a single undertaking. They don't want agriculture taken out of this. They don't want discussions of the precautionary principle taken out of this. So there's a lot of political pressure in that direction. So we see that pressure reflected in different ways. Last week in the United States, bills were introduced in Congress to authorize what's called fast track, which is the authority that would give the administration the authority to negotiate trade agreements behind closed doors and then present to Congress the finished deal for an up or down vote, no amendments possible, and limited floor debate. It's not at all clear whether that will pass or not. But one thing that's interesting, even in looking at the bill that's been introduced, are the negotiating objectives they lay out for the agreements. Now, these objectives are in no way binding. In fact, some of them have been there for decades in different agreements. Issues say labor and environment. But what they indicate is political pressure. It indicates the political actors that they're trying to satisfy when they want to get fast track. And among those negotiating objectives are one on what they call localization barriers to trade, which could be things like local food economies. It could be things, like in Malaysia, limiting halal, having their own system of certification for halal beef. Those, the U.S. has called very specifically localization barriers to trade, and it's something they want to eliminate in the trade agreement. They also want to make food safety standards enforceable under the trade agreement. That would be something new. We're not quite sure how that would happen, but I think it's something we need to be watching about. So we don't have trade text except for those bits that have leaked out so far. One issue we're concerned about, talking about local foods actors in the United States, are the EU's ambitions on procurement. As the last speaker just indicated, the EU would like to see commitments on procurement that go beyond the federal level, so state and municipal level commitments. They want all goods, all sectors, all levels of government. We have to wonder what this means for programs that support local foods in the United States. Programs like Farm to School, food hubs, could those be at stake? Maybe not, but we don't have text. We can't tell, so we have to be paying attention to this. We have to be making demands because it is a possibility, something that could be coming up. And then finally, I think something other speakers have perhaps indicated as well is we have the evidence of ongoing trade disputes. Clearly, the U.S. every year lists its primary obstacles to trade. There are two reports that come out, one on sanitary and phytosanitary standards, one on technical barriers to trade, where you can see sort of a laundry list of the things they're mad about. They're mad about GM. They're mad about EU restrictions on GMOs. They're mad about labeling in different contexts. On the EU side, we know that the EU has opposed country of origin labeling that the U.S. has tried to implement. So we look at these issues around labeling. We have to wonder what's next. Would it be, say, could this affect the GMO labeling campaigns that are underway in the United States? We don't know, but on all of these issues, we're not just making this up. We're taking some pretty educated guesses about really what could be at stake in these agreements. Now, another issue where we're really not guessing at all is around investment. And on that one, I think that one of the issues we're most concerned about is the egregious investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. That mechanism gives corporations the right to sue governments over measures that undermine their expected profits. Both governments have indicated that this will be part of the agreement because it's just how things are done. When they started out with investor-state mechanisms years ago, the argument they used was that in many countries, legal systems were not fully developed enough for corporations to feel, for investors to feel that they could make those investments and get fair treatment. I don't see how they make that allegation in this case when both countries have fully developed legal systems, and I think it makes it clear that that's not really the objective at all. If we think about how these investor-state has already affected agriculture, I think there are a few cases we can look at for indications of what might be coming down the road. Mexico, for example, was sued over its restrictions on high fructose corn syrup. This is a corn derivative. It's an unhealthy kind of sweetener. Mexico implemented some restrictions in order to shelter, to protect Mexican sugar farmers. They were sued by Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, and Corn Products International, and were awarded $169 million in compensation. Now, even if they had made the argument that they needed to have that restriction on public health grounds, it wouldn't have been enough under the trade deal. A second case that's underway now, Philip Morris is suing the governments of Uruguay and Australia over cigarette labels, saying that these cigarette labels that either require plain packaging or in one case some pretty graphic, ugly pictures, undermine their expected profits. I think that's kind of the point, right? When you make those kinds of restrictions on cigarettes. But it also makes me wonder what could be next. Could it be GMO labeling? I think it absolutely could. And then a recent case that I think perhaps other speakers will discuss too is Lone Pine, a company that has sued the government of Canada over the Quebec provincial government's restrictions on hydraulic fracking. They wanted to have a moratorium in order to do a very effective impact assessment. Lone Pine is suing, saying this undermines their expected profits. Now, most people you would talk to would say that Lone Pine is a Canadian company, but in fact, it turns out they also incorporated in Delaware. So they are able to sue as a U.S. company, as a foreign investor. And I think given how corporations tend to operate, particularly, and I would say especially between the United States and Europe, I think we can absolutely expect that kind of venue shopping should this kind of agreement go through. And then also related to investment is the issue of speculation. People who follow the food price crisis and the bouts of volatility that have led to food riots all over the world probably realize that the reckless speculation that's happened over the past few years has been a big contributing factor to food price volatility. People in the United States worked hard to implement reforms, the Dodd-Frank reforms on financial reforms, and I understand reforms are underway in Europe as well. Those kinds of rules, I think, would absolutely be threatened by banks who want to undermine them already. We have suits in the United States already. Banks that or other financial investors are suing over position limits, things on the number of contracts a particular company can have. These lawsuits are already underway. Putting it into the trade agreement just makes it easier. And the fact that the governments have agreed to include these kinds of financial rules within the trade agreement, within the negotiations, means that these rules on financial services could be traded off. So maybe we trade off financial service reform for more chlorine chicken access, whatever it might be. I don't know, but it could be traded off against something completely unrelated. So I think these are really dangerous issues that are specific to this particular agreement. I would like to be able to say I'm wrong on some of these things, but since we don't have text, this is our best guess at what could be on the table. I think we also have to think, though, about what we have to defend. And certainly, for the most part, in the United States, we look to the EU for its restrictions, its changes to food systems, restrictions on GMOs, use of precautionary principle, that is among local foods movements. But that doesn't mean that nothing's been happening in the U.S. These are the states that have active GMO labeling campaigns underway. The two marked in green have actually managed to pass that legislation, although they won't be implemented until a few more come on board. But you can see there are active campaigns in many different states. They're fighting considerable corporate pressure. That political pressure, that buildup on the ground in these different states, has also led to the introduction of a similar bill in Congress. So that would be at the federal level. Now, I think it's unlikely that will pass until we see more action at the state level, but this is something that's real, that's underway today. These are states where the legislatures are considering new reforms on toxic chemicals, things like BPA in baby bottles. I think in the United States, and I believe this is true among EU member states as well, that kind of progress most often starts at the local level and then builds upward. The proposals that have been made under TTIP for mutual recognition agreements would say that any chemical, or most chemicals that are considered acceptable in one jurisdiction, would be acceptable in the other. Now, looking at these two maps, I think it's also useful to look at the states that are involved. They're not exactly the same. There are a variety of different ideas about how to approach this. Like I said, a lot of activism on the ground, trying to make changes in how our food system works. One issue that is underway in all 50 states are farm-to-school programs. These are public procurement programs that give bidding preferences for locally grown foods. Those programs are, as I said, underway in all 50 states. There are federal programs as well as state-designed and municipal programs that vary a little bit. And their intentions are to get healthier foods into schools, but also to build connections between farmers and consumers, to educate children about the kinds of foods they're eating. They're expanding now into farm to hospital, farm to daycare, different kinds of programs that would change bidding preferences. We have to wonder, when we hear the EU wants bidding commitments, or procurement commitments, if this kind of program could be at stake. This is also happening at the municipal level. Probably the most exciting example is the Los Angeles Food Policy Council, which brings together restaurants, workers, farmers, consumers, school lunch programs, a whole array of private and public actors who are trying to reshape the food system and come up with new rules. they have developed this Good Foods Purchasing Pledge. Now that includes bidding criteria for procurement contracts that include things like local economies, environmental sustainability, valued workforce, animal welfare, and nutrition. These are criteria that don't tend to be allowed in trade agreements. We don't know if these are on the table until we see text, though. I think it's something we have to pay a lot of attention to. And I mentioned this one specifically because among the cities that the EU has listed as wanting to gain procurement commitments are 27 cities, including Los Angeles. So again, we have to wonder what's at stake. We have to activate people now to weigh in and talk about what's important to them. So finally, these kinds of efforts aren't just happening in the U.S. Clearly, they're not just happening in Europe. I think they're happening all over the world, different communities trying to retake control over their food systems. It means operating in a very different kind of way. And our concern is that the trade agreements will cut that kind of progress short. When we talk about, for example, the investor-state dispute resolution mechanism, that's been rejected at the WTO. It was rejected under the multilateral agreement on investment. But if it's approved here, if it's approved in a whole score of different bilateral agreements, then it becomes much harder for countries that aren't involved in these negotiations, say those in Latin America or Africa, to resist when it comes back at the global level. So what we do on these agreements is important not only for our own countries, but also what happens more broadly. And finally, I think we should perhaps take back some of these terms. It always makes me laugh when I see the term localization barriers to trade. To me, localization is a virtue. We're talking about a local farm-to-school program in Maine or an agroecology project in Malawi. It's about people retaking the system, changing the way things are done in a way that makes sense. It doesn't mean isolation, clearly, but it does mean putting decision-making where it needs to be, starting at the local level and then building up from there. So I think in our discussions of TTIP, we need to be keeping in mind our responsibility more broadly as well in what we do on this agreement and how that will affect food systems to come. Thanks.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, Frau Hansen-Kuhn. Wir machen es hier eben Verständnis, ich kann nicht lauter rufen, die Technik kommt gleich. Aber wir machen es hier eben Verständnisfragen direkt und ansonsten ist Hannes Lorenzen, der auch aus IATP arbeitet, gleich in der Diskussion und Frau Hansen-Kuhn steht auch für generelle Fragen zur Verfügung. Ihre Fragen und das Sandro ist aber unterwegs.
Ich hätte gern gewusst, was denn Ihre Einschätzung ist. Wer will dieses Abkommen mehr? Die USA oder Europa? Oder ist das Patt aus Ihrer Sicht?
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I can repeat in English. So, what is your impression? Who wants that TTIP more, the US or the Europeans, or is it similar?
I think it's the corporations that want it most, whether in the United States or Europe.
Drei Reihen weiter noch nach hinten. Nach hinten stellen wir
You talked about the possibility to sue states, and do you know if there is an alternative to those arbitration bodies which is on the table, which is discussed by the negotiation partners, or, I mean, something like a court, or are those arbitration bodies the only possibility on the table?
Well, the lawsuits would be against national governments, but they often pull the states in to defend their policies. There have been different discussions on what they call a model bilateral investment treaty that would allow for civil society to make amicus briefs to present their ideas, or perhaps to allow for justifications based on public health. But they're really pretty minor adjustments. It really is a flawed mechanism that doesn't make sense. I mean, this is something, you know, in each of these cases, corporations do have recourse to national court systems. There's really no justification, I think, for companies being able to bypass that system to go outside of it. And I would say also, if we think about this internationally, this has been a problem. Like I mentioned, a lawsuit against Uruguay, for example. In some cases, very small countries are being forced to spend considerable amounts of money just defending these suits. In that particular case, I think some foundations came in and helped them with legal costs. But we really have to ask, is that really how we want resources spent?
Thank you. Noch mehr Fragen?
Then, thank you so much.